The thunder rolled across the vast Montana sky as Jessie Matthews clutched her father's pocket watch, the last piece of him she had left. Blood mixed with rain on her trembling hands as she tried desperately to calm her spooked horse. The wagon wheel had broken clean off, leaving her stranded miles from anywhere in the middle of a storm that seemed determined to wash away what little hope she had left. Her father's body lay wrapped in canvas in the back of the wagon, and her tears mingled with the raindrops as she realized the impossibility of her situation. "I can't do this alone," she whispered, her voice breaking as lightning split the sky. "That's why you've got me," came a deep voice from behind her. Jessie whirled around, nearly losing her footing in the mud, to find herself staring up at a tall figure on horseback. The stranger dismounted in one fluid motion, his spurs jingling softly as his boots hit the ground. Water streamed from the brim of his hat as he approached, but even through the curtain of rain, she could see eyes as blue as a summer sky studying her with concern. "Name's Thomas Blackwood," he said, tipping his hat slightly. "Looks like you could use some help, madam. Montana Territory, 1876. The rain had finally stopped, but Jessie's problems had only begun. She stood beside her broken wagon as Thomas inspected the damage with practiced hands. At 23, she'd never been alone like this before. Her father had been everything: guide, protector, and friend since her mother's death 10 years prior. Now he was gone, taken by a rattlesnake bite that had turned deadly faster than she could get him to a doctor. "The axle's damaged too," Thomas said, wiping mud from his hands. "Can't fix this here." Jessie fought back tears. "I need to get my father to Clearwater for burial. I promised him." Thomas straightened up, his tall frame casting a long shadow in the emerging moonlight. "Clearwater? That's where I'm headed. Ranch business." His eyes softened as they fell on the canvas-wrapped form in the wagon. "I'm sorry about your father, madam." "Thank you," Jessie said, suddenly aware of how disheveled she must look with her honey-brown hair plastered to her face and her dress caked with mud. "We were traveling to start a new life there. My father bought land sight unseen from a man in St. Louis." Thomas frowned. "Land deals can be tricky out here. Do you have the deed?" Jessie nodded and reached into her pocket, producing a folded document protected in oilskin. "Right here. 5 acres with a small cabin, according to the seller." The cowboy examined the paper by the light of his lantern, his expression unreadable. "I know this property," he finally said. "It's not far from the Blackwood Ranch. The cabin's still standing, but it'll need work." "I'm not afraid of work," Jessie said, lifting her chin. She'd helped her father in his carpentry shop since she was tall enough to hold a hammer. "I just need to get there." Thomas handed back the deed and looked thoughtfully at his horse, then at the body in the wagon. "We can rig a travois for your father and leave the wagon. My horse can carry you, and we'll lead your horse behind. We can make Clearwater by tomorrow evening if we ride steady." "I couldn't impose. It's no imposition," he said firmly. "Night's coming on, and these parts aren't safe for a woman alone. Wolves, bears, and some men who are worse than either." Jessie shivered, not just from her damp clothes. "Why would you help a stranger?" Thomas was already untying the canvas covering his saddle. "My father taught me never to pass by someone in need. Besides," he added with a slight smile that transformed his weathered face, "we're going to be neighbors." As they worked together to create a proper travois for her father's body, Jessie studied her unexpected savior. Thomas Blackwood was perhaps 30, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and a face tanned from years under the Montana sun. His hands were calloused but gentle as they worked, and despite her grief, Jessie felt oddly comforted by his presence. "Have you lived in Clearwater long?" she asked as they secured the last knot. "Born and raised," he replied. "Blackwoods have been ranching that land for 20 years now. My father was one of the first settlers." "And your mother?" A shadow crossed his face. "She passed when I was 15. Fever took her quick." "I'm sorry," Jessie said softly. "My mother died when I was 13. Consumption." Their eyes met in the shared understanding that only orphans know. For a moment, they were connected by invisible threads of similar pain. "We should get moving," Thomas said, breaking the silence. "There's a spot about 3 miles ahead where we can make camp for the night. Creek nearby for water." As he helped her onto his horse before mounting behind her, Jessie felt the solid wall of his chest against her back, his arms reaching around her to take the reins. It had been years since she'd been this close to any man besides her father, and despite the propriety her father had instilled in her, she couldn't help but feel a strange sense of security. They rode in silence for a while, the rhythmic sound of hoofbeats and the occasional call of a night bird the only sounds. The moon had risen fully now, casting silver light across the rolling landscape. "Thank you," Jessie said finally. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't come along." "Just happened to be in the right place," Thomas replied, his voice rumbling against her back. "I was checking fence lines along the north property. Wasn't even supposed to be out this way today. Then I'm doubly grateful." When they reached the campsite, Thomas efficiently set about making a fire while Jessie tended to the horses. She'd grown up around animals and knew her way around a saddle, something that seemed to surprise and impress her companion. "Most city ladies I've met are afraid of horses," he commented as she expertly removed the bridle from her mare. "I'm not from the city," Jessie corrected him. "We lived in a small town outside St. Louis. My father was a carpenter, but he always kept a horse. Said a man never knows when he might need to leave in a hurry." Thomas nodded approvingly. "Smart man, your father." "The smartest," Jessie agreed, her throat tightening. "He taught me everything I know. Carpentry, riding, even how to shoot a rifle. Useful skills out here," Thomas said, coaxing the fire to life. "The West isn't kind to the unprepared." They shared a simple meal of jerky and hardtack from Thomas's saddlebags. Jessie had some preserves in her own pack, which they spread on the dry biscuits. It wasn't much, but with the warmth of the fire and the stars overhead, it felt like a feast. "What will you do when you reach Clearwater?" Thomas asked as they sipped coffee boiled in his tin pot. Jessie looked into the flames, considering. "Bury my father properly. Then make the cabin livable. After that." She shrugged. "I have some savings. Not much, but enough to get by for a while if I'm careful. My father taught me carpentry well enough that I might find work." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "As a female carpenter? Why not?" Jessie challenged. "I can drive a nail as straight as any man." He chuckled, a warm sound that seemed to chase away some of the night's chill. "I believe you. But Clearwater's a small town with old-fashioned notions. Might take some convincing." "Then I'll convince them," she said firmly, though doubt crept into her heart. She'd never had to make her own way before. Thomas studied her across the fire, respect evident in his gaze. "I think you just might at that, Miss Matthews." "Please, call me Jessie," she said. "If we're to be neighbors." "Jessie," he repeated, and something about the way he said her name made her cheeks warm in a way that had nothing to do with the fire. They set out again at first light after a cold breakfast. The travois slowed their progress, but Thomas set a steady pace that ate up the miles while being respectful of their solemn cargo. As they rode, he pointed out landmarks, telling her the history of the territory in his deep, steady voice. "That ridge there? Apache warriors used it as a lookout point until about 10 years ago. And see that stand of cottonwoods? Marks the boundary of what used to be Hayes' property before Old Man Hayes lost it in a poker game to Jeremiah Foster." "You know a lot about this area," Jessie observed. "Have to. Land out here tells stories if you know how to listen." He gestured toward a distant mountain range. "Those are the Bitterroots. Some of the prettiest country God ever made, but they can turn deadly in winter." As the day wore on, Jessie began to see signs of civilization. Fenced pastures, the occasional distant farmhouse, tracks of wagons in the dirt road they'd joined. By late afternoon, she could make out smoke from chimneys rising against the sky. "Clearwater," Thomas announced. "Not much to look at, but it's home." The town was indeed small, a single main street with wooden buildings lining both sides, a church steeple rising at one end, and what looked like a schoolhouse at the other. People moved about their business, stopping occasionally to eye the newcomers with curiosity. "Town's grown some since I was a boy," Thomas said. "Used to be just the general store, saloon, and a handful of houses. Now we've got a proper doctor, school, even a dressmaker's shop." They rode directly to a small building with a sign that read J. Tompkins, Undertaker. Thomas dismounted and helped Jessie down before speaking quietly with the somber man who came out to meet them. Arrangements were made, money changed hands, Thomas insisting on covering the cost despite Jessie's protests, and her father's body was respectfully transferred inside. "The funeral can be day after tomorrow," Thomas told her as they left. Gives time for the preacher to prepare and for you to settle in at your property. I need to see it, Jessie said, feeling suddenly overwhelmed. The reality of her situation was hitting her all at once alone in a strange town, with only the clothes on her back and whatever could be salvaged from the wagon later. Of course, Thomas agreed. But first, let's get you something to eat and find you some dry clothes. Mrs. Wilson at the boarding house might have something that would fit. An hour later, dressed in a borrowed dress that was slightly too large but blissfully clean and dry, Jessie sat across from Thomas in the town's small restaurant. The other diners cast curious glances their way, and she could hear whispers about Blackwood's girl that made her cheeks burn. Don't mind them, Thomas said, noticing her discomfort. Small town. They'll find something else to talk about by tomorrow. It's not proper, me being seen with you like this, Jessie murmured, though the hot beef stew in front of her was too tempting to abandon over mere gossip. Nothing improper about helping a neighbor, he replied firmly. Besides, my reputation's solid enough to withstand a little wagging tongues. After they ate, Thomas insisted on escorting her to her new property. They rode together again, this time with Jessie on her own horse, following a winding trail that led away from town and up into gently rolling hills. After about 2 miles, Thomas pointed to a small valley ahead. There it is, the old Miller place. Jessie's heart sank as they approached. The cabin was little more than a one-room shack with a sagging roof and a chimney that looked ready to collapse. The 5 acres surrounding it were overgrown with weeds and brush, and the small creek that ran behind it was choked with debris. Oh, was all she could manage. Thomas dismounted and tied his horse to a post that might once have been part of a fence. It needs work, he admitted, but the bones are good. Miller was a fine builder before the drink got him. Jessie climbed down from her horse and approached the cabin slowly. The door hung crookedly on leather hinges, and when she pushed it open, dust motes danced in the late afternoon sunlight that streamed through holes in the roof. Inside was a single room with a stone fireplace, a rough wooden table, and what might generously be called a bed frame in one corner. A family of mice scattered at their entrance. My father paid $50 for this, Jessie said hollowly. Thomas ran a hand along one of the walls. The wood's solid cedar. No rot. The roof can be patched, the chimney rebuilt. It's fixable, Jessie. She turned to him, suddenly angry not at him, but at the situation, at her father for dying, at herself for being so naive. I can't do this alone, she said, tears threatening again. Thomas stepped closer, his eyes holding hers steadily. That's why you've got me, he said quietly. I meant what I said about being neighbors. Blackwood Ranch is just over that rise. He pointed through the open door to a hill about half a mile away. And neighbors help each other out here. It's how we survive. Jessie wanted to protest, to insist she couldn't accept more charity, but the sincerity in his eyes stopped her. Why? She asked instead. Why help me so much? You don't even know me. Thomas looked around the cabin thoughtfully before answering. 8 years ago, I was caught in a blizzard miles from home. A stranger took me in, fed me, sheltered me for 3 days until the storm passed. Never asked for anything in return. When I tried to pay him, he just said, pass it on. So that's what I do. His simple explanation touched something in Jessie, and she found herself nodding. All right, but I insist on repaying you somehow. Fair enough, he agreed. For now, though, you can't stay here. It's not secure, and there are still predators that come down from the hills now and then. You'll stay at the boarding house in town until we can make this place habitable. The widow Wilson owns the boarding house. She's always looking for help with cooking and cleaning. And I know for a fact that Jacob Thornton at the Mercantile needs someone to help with his books. His eyesight's failing. Between those jobs, you can earn enough to pay for your room and board while we work on the cabin in our spare time. Jessie looked at him with growing admiration. You've thought this all through, haven't you? Thomas smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes and made them crinkle at the corners. Been thinking about it since we found your wagon yesterday. I'm a planner by nature, and I'm grateful for it, Jessie said sincerely. As they left the cabin, she took one last look back. Despite its sorry state, it was hers, the first thing she'd ever truly owned. With determination, she straightened her shoulders. I'll make it a home, she promised herself quietly. Thomas, already mounted, extended a hand to help her up. Yes, he said, having overheard her whisper, "You will." The following weeks fell into a rhythm. Jessie divided her time between working for Mrs. Wilson at the boarding house, keeping books for Mr. Thornton at the mercantile, and helping Thomas restore her cabin. True to his word, Thomas proved to be an invaluable ally. He brought tools, lumber, and occasionally other ranch hands to help with the bigger tasks like replacing the roof and rebuilding the chimney. Word spread quickly in the small town about the carpenter's daughter who could swing a hammer with the best of them. At first, there were raised eyebrows and disapproving murmurs from some of the more traditional townspeople, particularly when they saw Jessie in trousers, borrowed from Mrs. Wilson's deceased husband, working alongside Thomas on the roof. "It ain't proper," Jessie overheard Mrs. Hollister say to Mrs. Peterson outside the mercantile one afternoon. A young woman unchaperoned with Thomas Blackwood day after day, and wearing men's clothing. "In my day, she'd have been run out of town. Thomas Blackwood is a man of honor," Mrs. Peterson had replied firmly. "And that girl works harder than most men I know. You'd do well to mind your own business, Harriet Hollister." Jessie had smiled to herself, grateful for the unexpected defense. As the days passed, she found herself becoming part of the community, earning respect through her hard work and friendly demeanor. She attended church on Sundays, joined the ladies' quilting circle, though her stitches were atrocious compared to her carpentry skills, and gradually made friends. But it was her friendship with Thomas that deepened most significantly. They spent hours together working on the cabin, talking about everything and nothing as they hammered and sawed and plastered. She learned that he had an older brother who'd been killed in the war, that he could recite Shakespeare from memory, a result of his mother's insistence on education, and that he had a weakness for apple pie. In turn, she told him about growing up as the only girl in a town full of boys, about how her father had taught her carpentry when she showed more interest in it than in dolls, and about her dream of one day opening her own furniture-making shop. "You're good enough," Thomas told her one afternoon as they admired a rocking chair she'd crafted from scraps of wood. "This is fine work, Jessie. Better than most I've seen." His praise warmed her more than it should have, and she found herself watching him when he wasn't looking, the way the muscles in his arms flexed as he worked, how his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the gentle way he handled animals and spoke to children in town. It was dangerous territory, she knew. Thomas Blackwood was one of the most eligible bachelors in the territory, owner of a successful ranch, handsome, respected. Women far more suitable than a carpenter's daughter from Missouri set their caps for him regularly. Just last Sunday, she'd watched as Clarissa Jenkins, the banker's daughter, had practically thrown herself at him after church. "You should come to dinner, Mr. Blackwood," Clarissa had simpered. "Father so enjoys your company, and I've prepared a special apple cobbler. I remember how fond you are of apples." Thomas had declined politely, catching Jessie's eye over Clarissa's elaborate hat and giving her a small, private smile that had set her heart racing. By mid-October, the cabin was nearly complete. Thomas had helped her add a lean-to kitchen at the back, install glass windows ordered all the way from Denver, and build proper furniture. The place was small but snug, with cheerful yellow curtains sewn by Mrs. Wilson and a braided rug gifted by Mrs. Peterson. "It's really coming along," Thomas said one evening as they sat on the newly built porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. The air was crisp with the promise of winter, and Jessie had a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. "I couldn't have done it without you," she said, looking at the man who'd become so important to her in such a short time. "Sure you could have," he replied with a smile. "Might have taken longer, but you're the most capable woman I've ever met, Jessie Matthews." She felt herself blush and looked away. "Still, I'm grateful. I've been thinking about how to repay you." "No need for that." "But there is," she insisted, "and I think I've figured it out. Your foreman mentioned that the main house at Blackwood Ranch could use some work, new cabinets in the kitchen, repairs to the staircase. I could do that for you, as payment for all your help." Thomas was quiet for a moment, looking out at the darkening sky. "The house has needed work for years," he admitted. "After my mother died, it seemed less important somehow. But with winter coming..." He turned to her, his blue eyes serious in the fading light. "Are you sure? It would be weeks of work." "I'm sure," Jessie said firmly. "Besides, I'll be moving into the cabin next week. I'll need the work to keep me busy during the winter months." Thomas nodded slowly. "All right then. It's a fair trade." He stood up, stretching his tall frame. I should head back. Getting dark earlier these days. As he mounted his horse, he looked down at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. There's a harvest dance in town on Saturday. The whole community comes. Would you? That is, might you consider attending with me? Jessie's heart skipped a beat. With you? As my guest, he said quickly, though a flush crept up his neck. As friends. Neighbors. I'd like that, she said, trying to keep her voice steady despite the flutter in her chest. He tipped his hat, a smile breaking across his face. Good. I'll come by the boarding house at 7 then. As she watched him ride away, Jessie wrapped her arms around herself, feeling both elated and terrified. Was it possible that Thomas Blackwood might feel something beyond friendship for her? And if he did, what then? The harvest dance was the social event of the season in Clearwater. The town hall had been transformed with autumn decorations, dried corn husks, pumpkins, and colorful leaves adorned every surface. A small band played lively tunes while couples whirled around the dance floor and children darted between the adults. Jessie had agonized over her appearance, finally settling on her best dress, a dark green affair with modest lace at the collar and cuffs. Mrs. Wilson had helped her arrange her hair in a more sophisticated style than her usual practical braid, and had even lent her a pair of small pearl earrings. You look lovely, dear, the older woman had said approvingly. Thomas won't know what hit him. It's not like that, Jessie had protested weakly, though her racing pulse suggested otherwise. When Thomas arrived at the boarding house, he was dressed in his Sunday best, a dark suit that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders, his usually unruly hair tamed for the occasion. He stopped short when he saw her, his eyes widening slightly. You look beautiful, he said simply, offering his arm. The walk to the town hall was short, but charged with a new awareness between them. Thomas greeted people warmly as they entered, introducing Jessie to those she hadn't yet met. She noticed more than a few speculative glances and knowing smiles from the townspeople, but found she didn't mind as much as she might have expected. Would you care to dance? Thomas asked as the band struck up a waltz. Jessie hesitated. I should warn you, I'm not very practiced. The last time I danced was at a barn raising when I was 16. I'm no expert myself, he admitted with a grin. We can be terrible together. They weren't terrible, as it turned out. After a few awkward starts, they found their rhythm, Thomas leading confidently as they moved among the other couples. His hand was warm at her waist, and Jessie was acutely aware of how close they were, how his eyes never left her face. Everyone's watching us, she murmured, noticing the attention they were attracting. Let them watch, Thomas replied, his voice low. I only care what one person thinks right now. The intensity in his gaze made her breath catch. Before she could respond, however, they were interrupted by a commotion at the entrance to the hall. A man staggered in, blood streaming from a cut on his forehead. Raiders, he shouted. Jackson's place, they've set fire to the barn. The music stopped abruptly. Men moved quickly toward the door, Thomas among them. Stay here, he told Jessie firmly. I'll be back as soon as I can. But Jessie had no intention of staying behind. As the women gathered the children and the elderly to the safety of the back rooms, she slipped out after the men. Growing up with her father, she'd learned that extra hands were always needed in an emergency, regardless of whether they belonged to a man or a woman. The Jackson farm was about a mile outside town, close enough that they could see the orange glow of flames against the night sky. By the time Jessie arrived, a bucket line had already formed from the well to the burning barn. Thomas was in the thick of it, directing men while simultaneously helping to evacuate the frightened livestock. Without hesitation, Jessie joined the line, passing buckets alongside the men. No one questioned her presence in the crisis. She worked until her arms ached, breathing through the acrid smoke that burned her lungs. Gradually, they gained the upper hand against the flames. The raiders? She heard someone ask. Long gone, came the reply. Took Jackson's best horses and whatever they could grab from the house. It was nearly dawn by the time the fire was fully extinguished. The barn was a total loss, but they'd managed to save the house and most of the animals. Jessie sat on an overturned bucket, exhausted, her face streaked with soot and her fine dress ruined. Thomas found her there, looking almost as disheveled as she felt. I thought I told you to stay in town, he said, but there was no real anger in his voice, only concern. I couldn't just wait while people needed help, she replied, too tired to apologize. He sat beside her, running a hand through his smoke-scented hair. No, I suppose you couldn't. It's not in your nature to stand by. Who were they? The raiders? Thomas sighed heavily. Probably Harlan Briggs and his gang. They've been hitting isolated farms and ranches up and down the territory for months now. Law can't seem to catch them. Jessie shivered, suddenly realizing how cold it had grown as the adrenaline of the night wore off. Thomas noticed immediately and shrugged out of his jacket, draping it around her shoulders despite her protests. You've got soot on your face, he said softly, reaching out to brush a smudge from her cheek with his thumb. The gentle touch sent warmth spreading through her that had nothing to do with his jacket. Their eyes met, and for a moment, Jessie thought he might kiss her. Instead, he stood abruptly. Come on, he said, offering his hand to help her up. Let's get you back to town. You need rest. The ride back was silent, both of them too exhausted for conversation. But as they reached the boarding house, Thomas helped her down from his horse with hands that lingered slightly longer than necessary. I'm sorry about the dance, he said, his voice rough with fatigue. There will be other dances, Jessie replied, surprised by her own boldness. Thomas smiled, the first real smile since the alarm had been raised. Yes, there will be. And I intend to claim every one of them with you, Jessie Matthews. Before she could respond, he leaned down and pressed a brief, gentle kiss to her forehead. Get some sleep, he murmured, then mounted his horse and rode away, leaving Jessie standing on the porch with her fingers pressed to the spot where his lips had touched her skin. The raid on the Jackson farm proved to be just the beginning. Over the next 2 weeks, 3 more properties were hit, each one isolated, each attack coming under cover of darkness. The town was on edge, men taking turns standing watch at night, women keeping their children close. Thomas delayed Jessie's move to her cabin, insisting it wasn't safe for her to be alone so far from town. Though she chafed at postponing her independence, she couldn't deny the logic of his concern. Instead, she channeled her frustration into helping the Jackson family rebuild and starting work on the repairs at Blackwood Ranch, as she'd promised. The main house was impressive 2 stories of solid construction with wide verandas and tall windows. But Thomas had been right about it needing work. Years of bachelor living had left the interior somewhat neglected, particularly the kitchen where several cabinet doors hung at odd angles and the wooden countertops were scarred and stained. My mother would be horrified, Thomas said ruefully as he showed Jessie around on her first day. She kept this place spotless. It's a beautiful home, Jessie assured him, already mentally cataloging the repairs needed. It just needs some care. She quickly fell into a routine, riding out to the ranch each morning with one of Thomas's hands as escort, working through the day, and returning to town before dusk. Thomas was often busy with ranch business, but he made a point of stopping by to check on her progress, and sometimes joined her for the midday meal prepared by Mrs. Chavez, his housekeeper. It was during these quiet moments that their relationship continued to deepen. Thomas told her stories of growing up on the ranch, of cattle drives, and the changes he'd seen come to the territory. Jessie shared memories of her own childhood and her dreams for the future. There was an ease between them that Jessie had never experienced with anyone else. One afternoon, as she was measuring wood for new cabinet doors, Thomas appeared in the doorway of the kitchen, his expression troubled. Another raid last night, he said without preamble. The Peterson place this time. Took their entire winter food stores and shot Mr. Peterson when he tried to stop them. Jessie's hand flew to her mouth. Is he? He'll live, but it was close. Doc Jenkins says the bullet missed his heart by an inch. Thomas ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she'd come to recognize as a sign of his frustration. The sheriffs organized a posse. They're riding out this afternoon to try to track Briggs and his men. You're going, Jessie said, recognizing the determination in his eyes. Thomas nodded. I have to. These are my neighbors, my friends. Fear clutched at Jessie's heart. She'd heard stories of posses that never returned, of ambushes and brutal killings. When will you leave? Within the hour. I came to tell you myself and to ask. He hesitated, then continued. Would you look after things here while I'm gone? Mrs. Chavez is visiting her sister in Santa Fe, and someone needs to make sure the hands get fed and the accounts are kept. Jessie was stunned by the level of trust the request implied. Of course, she said immediately. But what about staying in town? You said it wasn't safe. I've spoken to Jake and Miguel, he said, referring to two of his most trusted ranch hands. They'll stay in the bunkhouse, and I've had them move your things from the boarding house to the guest room here. The ranch house is more secure than your cabin, and there will be men nearby. The thought of staying in Thomas's home, surrounded by his possessions and his life, was both thrilling and terrifying. How long will you be gone? A few days. A week at most. He stepped closer, his eyes serious. I wouldn't ask if there was another way, Jessie, but there's no one else I trust with this. I understand, she said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. I'll keep everything running smoothly until you return. Relief washed over his face. Thank you. He reached out, taking her hand in his. His palm was warm and calloused against hers. There's something else I need to say in case. He stopped, seeming to struggle with his words. In case what? Jessie prompted, her heart racing. In case things go badly, he finished quietly. Jessie, these past weeks, knowing you has changed things for me. Changed me. She held her breath, hardly daring to hope what his words might mean. I never expected to feel this way again after Caroline, he continued. Caroline. The name fell between them like a stone. Thomas looked away briefly. My fiancée. She died 6 years ago. Influenza. Understanding dawned on Jessie. This was why he'd remained unmarried despite being such a catch. Why there was sometimes a shadow in his eyes when he thought no one was looking. Thomas, I'm so sorry, she said softly. I thought that part of my life was over, he went on, his voice low and intense. I never thought I'd want to share my life with someone again. And then you came along with your determination and your courage and your skill with a hammer. A small smile touched his lips at that last part. Jessie's heart hammered in her chest as Thomas took both her hands in his. I know it's too soon to speak of certain things, he said. But I need you to know, before I ride out today, that you've become precious to me, Jessie Matthews. More precious than I ever thought possible. Tears pricked at Jessie's eyes. Thomas. A commotion outside interrupted them, men's voices calling, horses neighing. The posse was assembling. Thomas released her hands reluctantly. I have to go. I know, she whispered, fighting back tears. Be careful. I will. He hesitated, then quickly bent and pressed his lips to hers in a brief but tender kiss. Before she could react, he was striding out the door, leaving her standing in the kitchen with her fingers pressed to her lips and her heart racing. The days that followed were some of the longest of Jessie's life. She threw herself into the work of the ranch, overseeing the feeding schedules, checking the account books, and continuing her repairs on the house. The routine helped keep her mind off the dangers Thomas might be facing, though her sleep was plagued with nightmares of gunfire and blood. Jake and Miguel were respectful but reserved, clearly uncertain about having a woman giving them instructions. But Jessie's practical knowledge and willingness to work alongside them gradually earned their respect. By the third day, they were coming to her with questions about the operation and accepting her decisions without question. On the fourth night, a fierce storm blew in from the mountains. Wind howled around the house, rattling the windows and driving rain against the glass and sheets. Jessie sat in the parlor, trying to concentrate on mending one of Thomas's shirts by the light of an oil lamp. But her mind kept wandering to him out there somewhere in the deluge. A sudden pounding at the door made her jump. She grabbed the rifle Thomas had insisted she keep nearby and approached cautiously. Who's there? She called, her voice steady despite her racing heart. It's Jake, Miss Matthews. We've got trouble at the north pasture. Lightning struck the old oak and the cattle are scattered. Some might have gone through the broken fence. Jessie didn't hesitate. She set aside the rifle, grabbed Thomas's oilskin coat from its hook, and pulled on her boots. Outside, Jake waited on horseback, another mount saddled and ready beside him. Rain lashed at them as she swung into the saddle. Miguel's already headed up there with two of the boys, Jake shouted over the storm. But we need all hands. They rode hard through the darkness, guided only by occasional flashes of lightning that illuminated the landscape in stark relief. When they reached the north pasture, the scene was chaos, panicked cattle running in all directions, a massive oak tree burning despite the rain, and men on horseback trying desperately to contain the herd. For hours, they worked in the driving rain, turning cattle back from the broken fence line, guiding them towards safety. Jessie's muscles screamed with the effort of controlling her horse in the mud and wind, but she never faltered. By dawn, they had managed to recover most of the herd, though a dozen or so steers had escaped into the hills. "We'll track them once the storm passes," Miguel decided as they surveyed their work in the gray morning light. The rain had finally stopped, though the sky remained heavy with clouds. "You did good, Miss Matthews," Jake said as they rode wearily back to the ranch house. "Most women would have stayed by the fire." "I'm not most women," Jessie replied, too exhausted to be anything but honest. Jake chuckled. "No, madam, you surely ain't. The boss chose well with you." His words warmed her despite her sodden clothes and aching body. When they reached the house, she insisted the men come in for hot coffee and food before returning to their duties. As she moved around the kitchen, preparing a simple meal of bacon and biscuits, she realized she felt more at home here than she had anywhere since her father's death. The thought was both comforting and terrifying. What if Thomas didn't return? What if his feelings, expressed in that rushed moment before his departure, changed once he was back? What if her growing love for him, for she could no longer deny that's what it was, led only to heartbreak? Her dark thoughts were interrupted by the sound of hoofbeats in the yard. Jake moved to the window, rifle ready, then relaxed visibly. "It's the boss," he announced, and Jessie's heart leapt. "And looks like the sheriff's with him." Jessie rushed to the door, propriety forgotten in her relief. Thomas dismounted wearily, his clothes mud-splattered and his face gaunt with exhaustion. But when he saw her on the porch, his expression transformed, fatigue giving way to a smile that made her knees weak. "You're back," she said, stating the obvious in her joy. "I'm back," he confirmed, climbing the steps to stand before her. His eyes moved over her, taking in her disheveled appearance. "What happened? Are you all right?" "Lightning struck the north pasture fence last night," she explained quickly. "We had to round up the cattle in the storm. But everything's fine now." Pride replaced concern in his eyes. "You helped with that? In the middle of the night, in a storm?" "She was right in the thick of it, boss," Jake confirmed from the doorway. "Rode as well as any man and never complained once." Thomas's gaze held hers, something unspoken passing between them. The sheriff cleared his throat behind them, breaking the moment. "Sorry to interrupt, but we've got business to discuss, Thomas," he said, tipping his hat to Jessie. "Madam." Jessie stepped back, suddenly aware of how improper the situation might appear her in Thomas's home, clearly having spent the night. "Of course. Please, come in. I've just made coffee and breakfast." As the men settled at the kitchen table, Jessie busied herself serving them while listening to their conversation. The posse had tracked Briggs and his gang to an abandoned mining camp in the hills, but had been ambushed before they could close in. 2 men wounded, but none killed. "Thank the Lord," the sheriff was saying. "We managed to capture 2 of Briggs's men, but he escaped with the rest." "He'll be back," Thomas said grimly. "He's not the type to let this go." "That's why I'm here," the sheriff replied. "To warn folks to stay vigilant. We think he might target those who were in the posse, for revenge." Jessie nearly dropped the coffee pot. "Here? He might come here." Thomas's eyes met hers, concern evident. "It's possible, but the ranch is well staffed, and we'll double the watches." The sheriff nodded in agreement. "Briggs is dangerous, but he's not stupid. He knows attacking Blackwood Ranch would bring every rancher in the territory down on him. Still, better safe than sorry." After the sheriff departed, Thomas insisted on inspecting the damage to the north pasture himself, despite his exhaustion. Jessie accompanied him, filling him in on everything that had happened during his absence. As they rode, she couldn't help stealing glances at him, reassuring herself that he really was back safely. "You did well," Thomas said as they surveyed the repaired fence line. "Better than well. Jake says you kept the place running like you'd been doing it for years." Jessie felt a flush of pleasure at his praise. "I just did what needed doing." Thomas turned in his saddle to look at her directly. "That's what makes you special, Jessie. You see what needs to be done and you do it, regardless of whether it's women's work or not." Their eyes held for a long moment before Thomas looked away, scanning the horizon with practiced eyes. "Storms left the creek high," he observed. "We should check the lower pastures before heading back." As they rode side by side, Jessie gathered her courage. "Thomas, about what you said before you left." He glanced at her, his expression cautious. Yes. Did you mean it? She asked simply. Thomas reined his horse to a stop, and Jessie did the same. For a moment, he just looked at her, his blue eyes serious in his tanned face. Every word, he finally said. Maybe it's too soon. Maybe I should court you properly with dinner invitations and chaperone visits. That's what my mother would say. A small smile tugged at his lips. But out here, life's too uncertain to waste time on proprieties. I know what I feel, Jessie. Her heart soared at his words. And what is that exactly? Thomas dismounted and came to help her down from her horse. When she was standing before him, he took her hands in his, much as he had the day he left. I love you, he said simply. I think I started falling in love with you the moment you stood beside that broken wagon in the rain, determined to keep a promise to your father despite impossible odds. Tears filled Jessie's eyes, not from sadness, but from an overwhelming joy. I love you too, she whispered. I was so afraid to admit it, even to myself. After losing my father, I was terrified of loving someone else who might leave. I can't promise I'll never leave, Thomas said honestly. Life out here is hard and often short. But I can promise that as long as there's breath in my body, I'll come back to you. This time when he kissed her, there was no hesitation, no rush. His lips were gentle against hers at first, then more insistent as she responded. Her arms went around his neck as his encircled her waist, pulling her closer. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless. Marry me, Thomas said, his forehead resting against hers. Not someday, not when it's proper. Soon. I don't want to waste another day without you as my wife. Yes, Jessie replied without hesitation. Yes, I'll marry you. His smile was like the sun breaking through clouds after a storm, brilliant and full of promise. He kissed her again, briefly but tenderly, before reluctantly stepping back. We should head back, he said, though his eyes suggested he'd rather stay right where they were. There's much to do. As they rode back to the ranch house side by side, Jessie felt a happiness she hadn't thought possible after her father's death. There were still dangers, Briggs and his gang, the harsh Montana winters, the 1,000 natural perils of frontier life, but for the first time, she didn't feel alone in facing them. The town of Clearwater buzzed with the news of their engagement. Most were supportive, viewing the match as a natural culmination of the growing friendship everyone had observed. A few, particularly those mothers with eligible daughters, were less enthusiastic, but even they could not deny that Thomas and Jessie seemed well suited. Preparations for the wedding moved quickly. Thomas suggested waiting until spring, but Jessie, mindful of the sheriff's warning about Briggs, preferred sooner. I don't want anything to come between us, she told Thomas as they walked along the creek that bordered her property. They'd come to check on the progress of her cabin, which Thomas's men had continued working on despite her absence. Life's too uncertain, as you said. December, then, Thomas decided. Just before Christmas. It will give us time to prepare, but not so long that winter sets in fully. Jessie agreed, and plans were set in motion. Mrs. Wilson took charge of organizing the women of the town to prepare food for the celebration. The church was reserved, and Reverend Taylor began meeting with them to discuss the ceremony. Meanwhile, Jessie divided her time between completing the repairs on Thomas's house and preparing her own cabin, though they had decided she would move into the ranch house after the wedding. She wanted her property to be ready in case they needed to lease it to new arrivals in the spring. Thomas insisted she continue staying at the ranch house for safety, though propriety was maintained by Mrs. Chavez's return from Santa Fe. The older woman took an immediate liking to Jessie, especially after seeing the improvements to her kitchen. It's about time this place had a woman's touch again, she declared, admiring the new cabinets and freshly sanded countertops. And about time the boss found someone to make him smile again. As the wedding approached, only one shadow hung over their happiness, the continued threat of Harlan Briggs. Though there had been no further raids reported, the sheriff warned that Briggs had been spotted in the territory, possibly gathering new men to replace those captured. He's planning something, the sheriff told Thomas during one of his regular visits to outlying ranches. We just don't know what or when. Thomas increased security at the ranch, making sure Jessie was never alone when he couldn't be with her. Though she chafed slightly at the restrictions, she understood the necessity. The memory of the Jackson farm in flames was still vivid in her mind. One crisp November afternoon, 2 weeks before the wedding, Jessie was in town with Mrs. Chavez, finalizing details for her wedding dress with Mrs. Peterson, who had offered to sew it as a gift. Nothing too elaborate, Jessie insisted as they pored over pattern books. Something practical that I can wear again. Mrs. Peterson shook her head in mock despair. A wedding dress should be special, dear. You only get married once, God willing. What about this one? Mrs. Chavez suggested, pointing to a design that struck a balance between elegance and simplicity. With your figure, you could carry it beautifully. As they discussed fabrics and trimmings, a commotion erupted outside on the main street. Shouts and the sound of running feet drew them to the window. Men were hurrying toward the saloon, where the sheriff stood on the porch, his expression grim. Stay here, Mrs. Chavez instructed, but Jessie was already heading for the door. Outside, she pushed through the gathering crowd until she reached the edge of the saloon porch. The sheriff was addressing the assembled men, his voice carrying in the cold air. Attacked just after dawn. Took everything of value and burnt the rest. Mr. Foster is at the doctor's now, but Mrs. Foster and their hand didn't make it. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd. The Foster's ranch was one of the closest to town, less than 5 miles out. Briggs, someone called out. The sheriff nodded grimly. Foster recognized him. Said he was asking specifically about those who rode in the posse. Jessie's blood ran cold. Thomas had been part of that posse. If Briggs was targeting them systematically, she pushed forward. Sheriff, what about the Blackwood ranch? Have you sent warning? The sheriff spotted her, his expression softening slightly with sympathy. I sent a rider as soon as Foster was brought in, Miss Matthews. But the ranch is well defended. Thomas knows what he's doing. Despite his reassurance, Jessie couldn't shake her fear. I need to get back there, she said firmly. Nobody should be traveling alone right now, the sheriff countered. Wait for an escort. But waiting was impossible. Thomas might be in danger. Ignoring the sheriff's protests and Mrs. Chavez's pleas, Jessie hurried to the livery where her horse was stabled. Within minutes, she was galloping out of town, taking the direct route to Blackwood Ranch across open country rather than following the longer, winding road. The November air bit at her face as she rode, her mind racing with terrible possibilities. What if Briggs had already attacked the ranch? What if Thomas was hurt, or worse? The thought was unbearable. She was about halfway to the ranch, crossing a shallow stream, when she heard hoofbeats approaching rapidly from the west. Instantly alert, she guided her horse into a stand of cottonwoods, drawing the small pistol Thomas had insisted she carry. 3 riders appeared, moving fast. With a jolt of recognition, Jessie realized the lead rider was Thomas himself, with Jake and another ranch hand flanking him. Relief flooded through her, and she urged her horse out of hiding. Thomas, she called, waving to catch his attention. He reined in sharply, his expression transforming from grim determination to shock when he saw her. Jessie, what in God's name are you doing out here alone? I heard about the Foster place, she explained as she brought her horse alongside his. I was worried, so you decided to ride straight into potential danger? Thomas's voice was tight, with anger born of fear. Briggs and his men could be anywhere. I couldn't just wait in town not knowing if you were safe, Jessie retorted, her own fear making her voice sharper than intended. Thomas's expression softened slightly. I appreciate the concern, but please, never take a risk like that again. If anything happened to you. He couldn't finish the thought. I'm sorry, Jessie said more gently, but I feel the same way about you. Their eyes held for a moment, understanding passing between them. Then Thomas's practicality reasserted itself. We need to get back to the ranch, he said. The sheriff's organizing another posse, but we're checking on outlying properties first. Briggs seems to be working his way through a list. They rode together, keeping a vigilant watch on the surrounding landscape. Thomas explained that after receiving the sheriff's warning, he'd immediately dispatched men to alert neighboring ranches and check vulnerable points on his own property. The main house is the most defensible position, he told her. If Briggs does come, that's where we'll make our stand. The thought of their home, for she had come to think of it as hers, as well becoming a battleground, was chilling, but Jessie nodded resolutely. What can I do to help? Thomas gave her a sidelong glance that held both pride and concern. When we get back, I want you to inventory our ammunition and firearms. Make sure everything's cleaned and ready. Then help Mrs. Chavez prepare food that can be eaten cold if necessary. You think it will come to that? I'm praying it won't, Thomas replied grimly. But better to be prepared. When they reached the ranch, it was already being transformed into a fortress. Men were positioning wagons as barricades, moving livestock to protected pastures, and establishing observation points with clear lines of sight in all directions. Inside the house, Jessie worked efficiently, taking stock of their supplies and preparing for a potential siege. As she moved through the rooms that had become so familiar, she was struck by how quickly life could change. Just that morning, her biggest concern had been the details of her wedding dress. Now she was counting bullets and considering escape routes. Night fell without incident, but no one relaxed their vigilance. Thomas set a rotation of guards, with men positioned at key points around the property. Inside, lamps were kept dim to avoid silhouetting anyone against the windows. You should try to get some rest, Thomas told Jessie as midnight approached. They were in his study, where he'd been reviewing maps of the surrounding area, identifying potential routes Briggs might take. I'm not sure I could sleep, she admitted. Thomas looked up from his maps, his face shadowed in the low lamplight. Come here, he said softly. Jessie went to him, and he pulled her onto his lap, his arms encircling her in a protective embrace. She rested her head against his shoulder, drawing comfort from his solid presence. I'm sorry this is happening now, he murmured into her hair. 2 weeks before our wedding. It doesn't change anything, Jessie assured him, except perhaps to remind us how precious our time together is. Thomas pressed a kiss to her forehead. When this is over, I'm taking you away for a while. Just the two of us. Maybe down to Denver. The thought of such a journey their first as husband and wife brought a smile to Jessie's lips despite their current situation. I'd like that. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, each drawing strength from the other. Then a sharp whistle from outside, a signal from one of the guards, brought them both to attention. Thomas was on his feet instantly, moving to the window with the practiced stealth of a man who'd grown up in dangerous territory. Riders, he said quietly, coming from the East Ridge. Jessie joined him, peering into the darkness. In the moonlight, she could just make out multiple figures moving down the slope toward the ranch. How many? At least 10, maybe more, Thomas replied, already reaching for his rifle. Could be Briggs, could be the sheriff's posse. Either way, we need to be ready. He moved quickly through the house, alerting the men inside, while Jessie retrieved the extra ammunition she'd prepared. By the time she joined Thomas on the front porch, the riders were close enough that they could hear the jingle of tack and the soft thud of hooves on the packed earth of the yard. Who goes there? Thomas called out, his rifle ready but not yet aimed. Around the property, she knew his men were similarly positioned, waiting for his signal. Thomas Blackwood, a voice called back, unfamiliar, with a hard edge to it. That you? State your business, Thomas replied evenly, not confirming his identity. A harsh laugh floated through the darkness. My business is settling scores. You rode with the posse that killed 2 of my men. Now I'm collecting the debt. Briggs, Thomas murmured to Jessie, then raised his voice again. There are 20 armed men on this property. The sheriff knows you're in the area. You won't leave here alive if you start something. Maybe not, Briggs conceded. But neither will your pretty fiancée. Yes, I know all about her. The carpenter's daughter playing at being a rancher's wife. Jessie felt a chill at the realization that Briggs had been watching them, gathering information. Thomas's arm pressed against hers, slightly a silent warning to stay calm. What do you want, Briggs? Thomas asked, his voice steady despite the threat. Simple. You've got a fine herd of cattle. I want 50 head, plus all the horses in your north pasture. Oh, and whatever cash you've got in that safe of yours. And if I refuse? Briggs's voice hardened. Then we burn this place to the ground, with you in it. Just like we did to the Fosters. Thomas was silent for a moment, and Jessie knew he was calculating odds, considering options. Finally, he spoke again. I need to confer with my men. Give me 10 minutes. 5, Briggs countered. And don't try anything clever. My men have this place surrounded. As Briggs and his gang pulled back slightly to wait, Thomas quickly gathered his most trusted hands in the parlor. Options? He asked simply. We fight, Jake said immediately. We've got the advantage of position. And they've got the advantage of nothing to lose, Thomas countered. If we engage, people will die on both sides. So we just give them what they want? Miguel asked incredulously. They'll be back for more, boss. Men like that always are. Thomas nodded grimly. I know, but we need to buy time. He turned to one of the younger hands. Billy, how fast can you ride cross-country to town? The young man straightened. 20 minutes if I push it, sir. There's a way out through the root cellar, Thomas explained. A tunnel my father dug during the Apache troubles years ago. It comes out in the creek bed behind the barn. If you can get to the sheriff, tell him Briggs is here. And what do we do in the meantime? Jake asked. Negotiate, Thomas said firmly. Stall as long as possible. Briggs is many things, but he's not a fool. He wants our property, not a bloodbath that would bring the army down on him. The men nodded their understanding, and Billy slipped away to prepare for his ride. Thomas turned to Jessie. I want you to go with him, he said quietly. Get to town where it's safe. Jessie shook her head firmly. No, my place is here with you. Jessie, please, I can shoot, Thomas. I can reload. I can help the wounded if it comes to that. I'm not leaving. Their eyes locked in a battle of wills. Finally, Thomas gave a short nod. Stay inside, away from windows. And if I tell you to run, you run. No arguments. Jessie agreed, though privately she had no intention of leaving Thomas if things went badly. As the men returned to their positions, she caught Thomas's arm. Be careful, she whispered. He cupped her face briefly. Always. Then his expression hardened as he stepped back onto the porch to resume negotiations with Briggs. What followed was the most tense hour of Jessie's life. From her position inside, she could hear Thomas and Briggs trading offers and counteroffers. Thomas was masterful, raising minor objections, asking for clarifications, suggesting alternatives, all tactics designed to consume precious minutes while Billy raced toward town. Briggs's patience was clearly wearing thin. Enough stalling, Blackwood, he finally shouted. You've got 1 minute to start moving those cattle, or we open fire. Thomas's reply was drowned out by the sound of a gunshot not from the yard, but from somewhere to the west. Then another, and another. Shouts erupted from Briggs's men. It's the sheriff, someone yelled. Coming in from the ridge. Chaos erupted in the yard. Briggs bellowed orders to his men, some of whom were already turning to flee. Thomas dove back into the house as bullets began to fly, crashing through windows and splintering wood. Stay down, he ordered Jessie, who had already dropped to the floor. Outside, the gunfight intensified as the sheriff's posse engaged Briggs's gang. Thomas and his men returned fire selectively, careful to avoid hitting the lawmen in the confusion. Jessie crawled to a window, staying below the sill, and loaded rifles that Thomas and Jake fired in steady succession. The battle seemed to last forever, though in reality it couldn't have been more than 15 minutes. Gradually, the shooting tapered off, replaced by shouts as the sheriff's men rounded up those of Briggs's gang who hadn't escaped or been shot. Blackwood, the sheriff called. You folks all right in there? Thomas cautiously moved to the door. We're fine. Briggs got away in the confusion, but we captured 4 of his men. The rest scattered. Dawn was breaking as they finally emerged from the house to survey the damage. Miraculously, none of Thomas's men had been seriously injured, though the house itself had taken multiple bullets. 2 of Briggs's gang lay dead in the yard, and a third was wounded badly enough that the doctor, who had accompanied the posse, doubted he would survive. You got here just in time, Thomas told the sheriff as they stood on the porch, watching the prisoners being secured. Thank your man, Billy, the sheriff replied. Rode into town like the devil himself was on his heels. We were already assembled, just waiting for first light to ride out. Jessie joined them, handing cups of coffee to both men. The sheriff tipped his hat to her. Madam, heard you refused to leave when things got dicey. That's real courage. Or real foolishness. Thomas muttered, though his eyes were warm with pride when they met hers. What happens now? Jessie asked. Briggs is still out there. The sheriff sighed heavily. We'll keep searching, but my guess is he's hightailing it out of the territory. He's lost most of his men, and every rancher for 100 miles will be looking for him. You don't think he'll try again? Thomas asked skeptically. Not here, not now, the sheriff said confidently. He knows we're onto his pattern. He'll find easier pickings elsewhere. Jessie wasn't entirely convinced, but she kept her doubts to herself. For now, they were safe, and that was what mattered. As the morning progressed, the sheriff's posse departed with their prisoners, and the ranch began to return to something resembling normalcy. Thomas insisted Jessie rest, but there was too much to be done: windows to be boarded until glass could be ordered, meals to prepare for exhausted men, injuries to tend. It was late afternoon before she and Thomas found themselves alone for a moment in the kitchen. He came up behind her as she was kneading dough for bread, slipping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. "You were amazing last night," he murmured. "Steady as any of my men." Jessie leaned back against him, relishing his warmth and solidity. "I was terrified," she admitted, "but not of Briggs. I was afraid of losing you, of losing this." She gestured vaguely, indicating not just the house, but everything they were building together. Thomas turned her in his arms to face him. There was a new intensity in his eyes. "I don't want to wait 2 more weeks," he said. "I want to marry you now, today if possible." Jessie blinked in surprise. "Today? But what about the preparations, the dress, none of that matters," Thomas interrupted gently. "Last night showed me how quickly everything can change. I don't want to waste another day not being your husband." The certainty in his voice convinced her. "All right," she agreed. "Today." Within hours, word had spread through the ranch and into town. Reverend Taylor was fetched, looking slightly bewildered by the sudden change of plans, but willing to accommodate them. Mrs. Chavez and Mrs. Wilson ransacked trunks and closets until they found a suitable dress, not white, but a lovely pale blue that brought out the gold in Jessie's hair. As the sun began to set, casting long golden rays across the land, Jessie stood with Thomas on the porch of what would now truly be their home. The ranch hands had gathered in the yard, cleaned up as best they could for the occasion. The sheriff was there too, along with those townspeople who could make the journey on short notice. It wasn't the wedding they had planned. There was no elaborate meal, no carefully decorated church, no new suit for Thomas or specially made dress for Jessie. But as they spoke their vows, looking into each other's eyes with the last light of day turning everything to gold, Jessie knew it was perfect in its own way. "I, Thomas, take you, Jessie, to be my lawfully wedded wife," Thomas said, his voice steady and sure. "To have and to hold, from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part." Jessie repeated the words, her heart so full she thought it might burst. When Reverend Taylor pronounced them husband and wife, Thomas kissed her with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes and cheers from the assembled guests. The celebration that followed was impromptu but joyous. Someone produced a fiddle, and the yard became a dance floor under the stars. Mrs. Chavez and the women who had come from town somehow managed to create a feast from the ranch's stores, and if the wedding cake was actually just a sweetened cornbread with honey drizzled over it, no one seemed to mind. Late that night, when the guests had gone and the ranch was quiet, Thomas carried Jessie over the threshold of their bedroom, not as tradition dictated into a new home, but into a new life together. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said softly as he set her down, his hands lingering at her waist. "I like the sound of that," Jessie replied, reaching up to touch his face. In the lamplight, she could see every line, every scar that told the story of his life before her. "I love you, Thomas Blackwood, and I love you." His kiss was different now, deeper, with a promise of the night to come. "I think I've loved you since that moment in the rain when you said you couldn't do this alone." Jessie smiled against his lips. "And you said that's why I've got you. Always," Thomas promised, drawing her closer. "For as long as there's breath in my body." Winter settled over Montana territory, blanketing the land in pristine white. The threat of Briggs faded as reports came in that he had been spotted crossing into Dakota territory, presumably to find new territory to terrorize. Life at Blackwood Ranch fell into a comfortable rhythm as Thomas and Jessie adjusted to married life. For Jessie, becoming mistress of such a large operation was both challenging and rewarding. She learned the intricacies of cattle ranching, studied the account books until she understood every aspect of the business, and gradually won the complete respect of the ranch hands who had initially been skeptical of their boss's city-bred wife. Thomas, for his part, seemed to thrive with Jessie by his side. The shadow that had lingered in his eyes since Caroline's death years ago disappeared, replaced by a contentment that was evident to everyone who knew him. Even his business decisions became bolder, more forward-thinking, as if his personal happiness had given him new confidence in the future. They still worked on Jessie's cabin when weather permitted, turning it into a snug guest house that could be used by visitors or possibly leased to newcomers to the area. Thomas had suggested selling it, but Jessie wanted to keep it her first real property, a tangible link to her father and the journey that had brought her to Thomas. As winter gave way to spring, and the ranch came alive with new calves and green grass, Jessie began to suspect a new change was coming to their lives. When Dr. Jenkins confirmed her suspicions during a visit to town, she could hardly contain her joy on the ride home. Thomas was in the corral, working with a young horse, when she arrived. He saw her immediately, as he always seemed to, and came to meet her, his face lighting up as it did whenever they'd been apart, even for just a few hours. "How was town?" he asked, helping her down from her horse. Jessie couldn't keep the news to herself a moment longer. "I saw Dr. Jenkins," she said, watching his face carefully. Concern immediately replaced his smile. "Are you ill? You seem tired lately, but I thought it was just spring coming on." "I'm not ill," she assured him, taking his hands in hers. "Thomas, we're going to have a baby. In the fall, around harvest time." For a moment, he simply stared at her, as if her words weren't quite making sense. Then a joy unlike anything she'd ever seen transformed his face. He lifted her off her feet, spinning her around as she laughed with delight. "A baby," he repeated when he set her down, his voice filled with wonder. Our baby, Jessie confirmed, her own happiness reflected in his eyes. "I think your mother would approve of us expanding the Blackwood family." Thomas placed a gentle hand on her still flat stomach. "And your father? What would he think?" Jessie covered his hand with her own. "He'd be happy that I found someone who lets me be exactly who I am. Someone who never asks me to be less than I can be." As summer bloomed across the Montana landscape, so did Jessie. Her pregnancy agreed with her, bringing a glow to her skin and a new softness to her body that Thomas found endlessly fascinating. Though she couldn't participate in the more strenuous ranch activities, she found plenty to keep her busy supervising the expansion of the main house to include a proper nursery, tending her vegetable garden, and finishing the furniture for their growing home. Word came that Harlan Briggs had finally been captured in Dakota Territory after a shootout that had left him wounded. He would stand trial for multiple murders and robberies, and the likelihood was that he would hang. The news brought closure to the community that had lived under his shadow for so long. "I'm glad," Jessie told Thomas as they sat on the porch one evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. "Not that he'll hang, necessarily, but that justice will be done. The Fosters deserve that much at least." Thomas nodded, his hand resting gently on the swell of her belly where their child grew. "The West is changing," he observed. "When my father first came here, justice was whatever a man could enforce with his own gun. Now we have courts, proper trials. Is that a good thing, do you think?" Jessie asked, genuinely curious about his perspective. Thomas considered the question seriously. "Mostly. Law brings stability, makes it safer for families." He smiled down at her rounded middle. "For children to grow up. But I hope we never lose the spirit that brought people out here in the first place, the willingness to face challenges head-on, to build something from nothing. Like I did with my cabin." Jessie suggested with a smile. "Exactly like that," Thomas agreed, leaning over to kiss her softly. "That's what I want to teach our children, your determination, your courage." "Children? Plural?" Jessie raised an eyebrow teasingly. "Let's get through this one first, Mr. Blackwood." Thomas laughed, the sound floating out over the land that had been in his family for generations and would now pass to a new generation they were creating together. "Yes, madam, Mrs. Blackwood." The baby came on a crisp October morning, after a labor that left Jessie exhausted but triumphant. Thomas, who had paced outside the bedroom door for hours despite Mrs. Chavez's attempts to send him elsewhere, was finally admitted to meet his son, a robust, red-faced boy with a shock of dark hair like his father's and eyes that, when briefly opened, showed hints of Jessie's warm brown. "He's perfect," Thomas whispered, cradling the tiny form with hands that usually handled ropes and reins. "What shall we name him?" Jessie, propped up on pillows and glowing despite her fatigue, smiled at the sight of her strong husband rendered so gentle by this small new life. "I was thinking, James, after my father." James Blackwood. Thomas tested the name, nodding in approval. A good, strong name for a boy who'll grow up on this land. As Thomas placed their son in her arms, Jessie felt a circle completing the journey that had begun with loss, and a broken wagon in the rain had led her here, to this moment of perfect happiness. The path hadn't been easy or straightforward, but every step had been necessary. I was so afraid that day we met, she admitted softly, gazing down at their child. So convinced I couldn't possibly manage alone. Thomas sat beside her on the bed, his arm around her shoulders, his other hand gently touching their son's tiny fingers. And I told you that's why you had me. Jessie looked up at him, her heart so full it seemed impossible to contain. I thought you were just being kind to a stranger, she said. I had no idea you were offering me a lifetime. Neither did I, Thomas admitted with a smile. But sometimes life gives you exactly what you need, exactly when you need it most. Outside their window, the Montana sky stretched endlessly blue over the land that was their home and would be their son's heritage. Inside, in the warmth of their embrace, with their child between them, they had created something neither could have built alone: a family, a future, a love that would endure through whatever challenges lay ahead. Thank you, Jessie whispered, nestling against Thomas's solid strength. For what? He asked, pressing a kiss to her hair. For being there that day in the rain. For helping me see that I was never truly alone. Thomas tightened his arm around her, his voice rough with emotion. And thank you for teaching me that a heart can heal and love again, even when you think that part of life is over. As baby James drifted to sleep in his mother's arms, Thomas Blackwood looked at his family, the wife he'd found in the most unexpected circumstances, and the son who represented their future, and knew with absolute certainty that whatever storms might come, they would weather them together. For Thomas and Jessie Blackwood had discovered the greatest truth of the frontier, that while a person alone might survive, it took two hearts beating as one to truly thrive in this wild, beautiful, unforgiving land.